The Tuesday they asked me for my keys, the young man did not even look up from his laptop. He held out one hand, palm open, like I was a valet and he was waiting on his car. The other hand kept typing. He said, real soft and real pleasant, "We'll take it from here, Sister Naomi. You've done enough." You've done enough. 30 years. And that is the sentence they chose. I want you to remember that hand, palm up, waiting. Because by the time this story is over, that whole room is going to learn what 30 years of carrying those keys actually bought. And it was a great deal more than any of them knew how to count. My name is Naomi Calloway. I am 59 years old, and I live in Macon, Georgia, in the same brick house my husband Curtis and I bought the year our daughter was born. I keep books. That is the plain word for what I do, and I have never needed a fancier one. For most of my working life, I was the bookkeeper for a textile supply company off Eisenhower Parkway, and for 30 years on top of that, I kept the books for Greater Mount Moriah Baptist Church. If you grew up in a church like mine, you already know the woman I am. Every congregation has one. The one who knows where the money is, where the money went, and why the lights stayed on the winter everybody else thought they wouldn't. Before I go on, do me a favor. If your church has a woman like that, somebody who held it together while other folks held the microphone, say her name in the comments. I want to read them. Some of you are going to recognize this story before I even finish telling it. Now let me tell you how I came to those keys, because you cannot understand the insult unless you understand the labor. I started keeping the books at Mount Moriah when I was 29 years old. I did not volunteer for it out of pride. I volunteered because the church was about 90 days from losing its building, and nobody wanted to look at the reason why. The deacon who had been handling the money was a sweet old man who could pray heaven down on a Sunday, but he kept the offering in a cigar box and the records in his head, and his head had started to slip. There were notices coming from the bank that he was hiding in his coat pocket. I found them because I was the one who finally cleaned out the supply closet behind the choir stand. And there they were, 11 envelopes, all stamped past due. I sat in that closet on an upturned milk crate and I read every one. And here is the thing I have come to know about money, the thing I have built my whole quiet life on. Money does not lie. People lie. People will stand at a podium and tell you the church is blessed and growing and full of favor. And the numbers in the book will sit there, patient as scripture, and tell you the truth underneath the testimony. A ledger is the most honest book in the building, second only to the one on the pulpit. You just have to be willing to read it. So I read it. I sat down with the pastor we had back then, Reverend Settles, a man who had the grace to know what he did not know. And I told him the church was drowning, and nobody had told him because telling him felt like disloyalty. He did not get defensive. He asked me a question I have never forgotten. He said, "Naomi, can you fix it? Not, is it bad? Not, whose fault is it? Can you fix it?" That is what respect sounds like, in case you have forgotten. It sounds like somebody handing you a problem because they believe you can carry it. I could fix it. It took me 4 years. I built a real set of books, the kind that could survive an audit, because I had decided that this house of God was never again going to be one cigar box away from the auctioneer. I set up a building fund, and I guarded it like it was my own child's college money. I went line by line through every vendor and found the ones overcharging a church they assumed could not read a contract. I renegotiated the loan. I caught a bookkeeping error from the lender's side that had been costing us almost $400 a month, and when I brought it to them, the loan officer looked at me like the adding machine had grown a mouth. By the time I was finished, Greater Mount Moriah owned its building free and clear. Free and clear. No mortgage, no lien, no notice in anybody's coat pocket. We owned the sanctuary, the fellowship hall, the parking lot, and the little house next door we used for the food pantry. I built the reserve up to where we could cover 6 months of operating costs without a single new dollar coming in. I wrote the grant that got the new roof. I set up the scholarship fund that has put 19 of our young people through their first year of college. And I can tell you all 19 names, and I can tell you what every one of them is doing now. Let me give you just one of those names, because numbers are easy to forget, and a child is not. Andre Pittman. His mother cleaned offices downtown, and his daddy was not in the picture. And the year Andre graduated high school, he had the grades for Fort Valley State, but not the money for the deposit. I knew that because I knew everything that moved through that church, and I wrote him a check from the scholarship fund I had built, dollar by dollar, and I did not make a ceremony out of it. Andre Pittman is an engineer in Atlanta now with 2 children of his own, and he calls me every year on my birthday. That is what a ledger does when a woman keeps it right. It does not just balance. It sends children to college. And the year after I set those books straight, the church passed its first real audit without a single finding. And a few years after that, when a letter came from the government asking questions, I answered every one of them in a single afternoon, because I had never once kept a record I was afraid to show. You cannot frighten a woman with an audit when she has been ready for one since the day she found those notices in the closet. And the keys? Reverend Settles gave me the keys to the fellowship hall the spring I turned 33, the day he announced from the pulpit that the church was debt-free. He did not make a speech about me. He just walked down off that pulpit in front of everybody and put a ring of keys in my hand and folded my fingers over it. He said, "This house is in good hands." That ring had 11 keys on it by the end. The hall, the kitchen, the pantry, the storage closets, the side door nobody used, the gate. I carried it in my purse for 26 years. It was heavy. I liked that it was heavy. A thing that opens that many doors ought to have some weight to it. I am telling you all of this so you understand. I was not the help. I was the foundation. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole story. Reverend Settles passed 2 winters ago. We buried him on a cold Saturday, and the whole city came. And the church did what churches do. It went looking for somebody new, and it found Pastor Marcus Dean. Now, I want to be fair to that man, because this is not a story about a monster. Pastor Dean is 36 years old. He has a degree in divinity and a degree in business, and he is genuinely gifted in front of a crowd. He came to us from a big church up in Atlanta with a podcast and a building program and a way of talking about growth that made the younger families sit up. He was not lazy, and he was not cruel. He believed all the way down that he had been sent to bring Greater Mount Moriah into a new era. The trouble was that he could not imagine the old era had anybody in it worth keeping. The first time we met, he shook my hand and called me Sister Naomi, which was fine, and he asked me how long I had been. And here he paused and smiled, helping out with the little finances. Helping out with the little finances. The reserve I built was $250,000. There was nothing little about it. But I smiled back because I am a grown woman and I have shaken a lot of hands. And I said, "About 30 years, Pastor." And I watched something flicker across his face. Not respect, recalculation. He had just learned that the old woman with the keys knew where everything was, and I do not think it made him feel safer. I think it made him feel watched. Within a month, he brought in a consultant, a man named Trent Buckley, who ran a firm that promised to modernize church operations, and who walked into my office, the one I had kept for 30 years, and set his coffee down on my desk without asking, and looked at my filing system and said, "Don't worry, we'll get all this onto the cloud." Don't worry. As if I had been worried. As if the system that had survived 3 audits and 1 IRS inquiry without a single finding was something to apologize for. Mr. Buckley liked to explain things to me. He explained what a balance sheet was. He explained, slowly, what it meant to reconcile an account. One afternoon, he stood in my doorway and asked me, in the gentlest voice you ever heard, whether I was comfortable with computers or whether we should find someone to help me. I had been running our books on a spreadsheet since before that man finished high school. But I have learned that there is no winning the moment somebody decides you are slow. If you correct them, you are difficult. If you let it go, you are exactly what they thought. So I said, I manage. And he smiled like I had confirmed something. And he went back to telling the pastor that the finance office needed a fresh set of eyes. And then there was the report. Every quarter for 30 years I had produced a financial statement for the congregation. 1 page, plain English, every dollar accounted for, because people have a right to understand their own giving. That spring, one of Mr. Buckley's young men took my report, put it into a new template with the church logo and a great deal of blue, changed not one single number, because there was nothing to change, and presented it to the deacon board as the new reporting we've implemented. The same numbers, my numbers, in a prettier dress, with somebody else's name down at the bottom. Nobody meant it as a theft, and that is exactly what made it sting. They had simply stopped being able to see that the work was already being done, and done well, by the woman they had decided was the past. Then came the meetings I was no longer invited to. For 30 years, the Finance Committee met on the second Monday, and I ran it. I made the agenda. I walked them through the statements. I answered every question. And there were always questions, because that is what good stewardship looks like. Then one second Monday, I showed up, and the door was locked. And through the glass, I could see them all in there, the pastor and Mr. Buckley and 2 young men I had never seen before, and a slide on the wall that said, Vision 2030. Nobody had told me the meeting moved. When I asked the pastor about it after service, he put his arm around my shoulder, warm as Sunday, and said, Oh, Sister Naomi, we didn't want to keep bothering you with all that. You've earned a rest. You've earned a rest. There it was again, the whole language of pushing a woman out the door, dressed up like a gift. I want to pause here and tell you about a Wednesday at the bank, because this is the part some of you are going to feel in your chest. The church accounts were at a bank downtown, and there was a signature card that needed updating now that the leadership had changed. The pastor and I went together. I had been a signer on those accounts for 30 years. I knew the branch manager's mother. I had sat across that very desk when the building loan got paid off and watched them stamp it satisfied. So we walk in, the pastor and me, and a young loan officer I did not recognize comes out to greet us. And she looks at the pastor in his nice suit, and she looks at me, and she says to him warmly, Right this way, sir, and your assistant can wait here. We have coffee. Your assistant. The pastor did not correct her. That is the part I sat with later. He did not say, This is Mrs. Calloway. She has been the financial officer of this church for 30 years. She is the reason these accounts exist. He just smiled and let it stand and walked on back. And I stood there by the coffee I did not want. Being somebody's assistant in a building where my signature was on file more times than his name had ever been spoken. Now, I've lived long enough to know that young woman was not evil. She saw a man and a woman, she saw a suit, and she saw gray hair and brown skin, and her mind did the arithmetic it had been taught. That is the thing about being underestimated when you look like me. It is rarely a slap. It is 1,000 small assumptions, each one small enough that if you name it out loud, somebody will tell you that you are being sensitive, that she did not mean anything by it, that you should let it go. And you learn to let it go, and you let it go, and you let it go, until one day you have let go of so much that there is a man's open palm in your face asking for your keys, and you finally understand that all that letting go was just teaching everybody around you exactly how little you would defend. There was one person in that bank who saw me, an older teller named Gloria, who had worked that branch 20 years, and who came around the counter while I stood there and said, low, just for me, "Mrs. Calloway, it is good to see you. The church is blessed to have you." She did not make a scene. She did not have to. She just put my name back in my hand. I have thought about Gloria many times since. Sometimes the whole of somebody's dignity is restored by one person, in passing, who refuses to pretend you are invisible. Here is what they did not understand. The pastor and Mr. Buckley, while they were busy finding me a rest I never asked for, I was still reading the numbers. They had taken my meetings, and they had taken my agenda, but they had not taken my eyes. And a woman who has read a ledger like Scripture for 30 years does not stop seeing just because you stop inviting her to look. And what I saw in the statements they thought I no longer received was that something was wrong. It started small, the way these things always do. The building fund, the one I had guarded for 26 years. The $250,000 that meant Greater Mount Moriah would never again be 90 days from the auctioneer, had a transfer on it. Not a withdrawal, a transfer into a new operating account I did not recognize, set up by the consultant. And then another. And the language in the new financial reports, the slick ones with the color charts that Mr. Buckley produced, started using a word I had never once used in 30 years of keeping that church solvent: leverage. They were talking about leveraging the building, borrowing against the very thing I had broken my back to set free. I knew exactly what was happening, because I had seen the shape of it before, in companies, in families, in churches. A new man comes in with a big vision and no patience, and he looks at a paid-off building and a healthy reserve, and he does not see 30 years of careful stewardship. He sees collateral. He sees a way to fund his dream now instead of building it slow. And the people cheering him on in those locked meetings did not know what I knew, which was that the plan on that wall, Vision 2030, would put our debt-free house right back under a mortgage, and that if the growth he promised did not come fast enough, my church, Curtis's church, the church where I buried my mother and my husband, could lose its building all over again. Only this time, there would be no 29-year-old in the supply closet reading the notices, because they had retired her. So I did what I do. I started keeping receipts, quietly. Every statement that still came to me, I saved. Every transfer, I logged, with the date and the amount and the account, the way I had logged everything for 30 years. I pulled the original loan satisfaction, the document that proved we owned the building outright, and I made sure I knew exactly where it was. I am not a dramatic woman. I did not confront anybody in a hallway. I just built, the way I always build, a quiet and complete and undeniable record of the truth. Because I have always believed that when the day comes, you do not need to raise your voice if you can simply open the book. But I will be honest with you now, because this is the part of the story I am least proud of, and the part some of you need to hear most. I almost did not open it. There was a night, about a week before the annual business meeting, when I sat at my kitchen table with all of it spread out in front of me, all the receipts, all the proof, and I almost put it in a drawer and let them have it. I want you to understand how close I came. I told myself I was too old to be fighting. I told myself it would split the church, that the young families loved Pastor Dean, that if I stood up in that meeting and laid out what I had found, half the congregation would not hear a faithful steward protecting God's house. They would hear a bitter old woman who could not let go of her keys. I told myself, Naomi, you have given this church 30 years. Do you want the last thing they remember of you to be a fight? And underneath all of that, there was something smaller and meaner that I had to sit with. I was tired of having to prove it. I was tired of being the one who had to read the notices, catch the errors, carry the weight, and then defend the carrying of it. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from spending your whole life being excellent in a room that keeps asking you to prove you belong in it. And that night, I felt every year of it. That fellowship hall was not a building to me. We held Curtis's repast in that hall, and the women of the church covered every table with food so that I would not have to cook for a single week. My mother's 85th birthday was in that hall, the last good day before she got sick. I had mopped that floor on Saturday mornings and counted offering on those tables and watched babies I had held at the font grow up and get married under that same low ceiling. To stand up and fight in that room felt like taking a hammer to my own memories. And the easiest thing in the world, the thing every tired bone in my body was begging me to do, was to let the young man have his vision, keep my mouth shut, and be remembered as gracious. I did not sleep. I sat at that table until the streetlight outside cut off the way it does around 4 a.m, and I prayed. Not pretty prayers, the real kind, the kind that is mostly just sitting there with God and being honest. And somewhere in there, I stopped asking whether I should fight, and I started asking a different question. I asked myself who I had become the bookkeeper for in the first place. I did not do 30 years for a pastor. I did not do it for a title or a ring of keys. I did it for a little church that was 90 days from the auctioneer and for every soul who would ever walk through its doors after me. I built that reserve for people who were not even born yet, and I had no right to let a man borrow against their inheritance just because I was too tired and too proud to be talked down to one more time. So I dried my face, and I made a fresh pot of coffee, and I put every page in order. Not to win, to tell the truth. There is a difference. And by morning, I knew which one I was doing. The annual business meeting at Greater Mount Moriah is held the third Sunday after the new year, in the fellowship hall, the one whose keys I carried for 26 years. The whole church comes, and that year the room was full, because word had gotten around about Vision 2030, and the new families were excited, and the old members were uneasy, and a full room is a nervous room. Pastor Dean preached a short word first, about new wine and new wineskins, about not being so attached to how things used to be that we miss what God is doing now. It was a good sermon. He is a gifted man. I told you that. And he was talking straight at me without ever saying my name. Then Mr. Buckley got up with his color slides and his laser pointer, and he walked the church through Vision 2030, a new family life center, a gymnasium, a coffee bar in the lobby. And to fund it, he said, smooth as butter, the church would be unlocking the equity in our existing facilities. Unlocking the equity. That is what they call it when they put your paid-off house back in hock and hope you do not know the words. He asked if there were any questions before the vote. And I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I have told you, the woman who can open the book does not need to. I said, Pastor, Mr. Buckley, before we vote, I think the congregation should see the actual numbers, the ones in the ledger, not the ones on the slide. Mr. Buckley smiled and started to say that the financials were summarized for clarity, and I said, gently, that summaries are where things go to hide, and that this church had a right to the unsummarized truth about its own money. And then I opened the book, the real one, 30 years of it. I did not accuse anybody of stealing, because nobody had stolen anything, and I have no interest in telling you a lie to make a villain. What I showed them was simpler and harder than theft. I showed them that the building fund I had guarded for 26 years had already been transferred, $240,000 of it into a new account, and that the Vision 2030 plan they were about to vote on would borrow another $600,000 against a building this congregation had owned free and clear since the spring I turned 33. I held up the loan satisfaction, the document that said this house belonged to us and to nobody else. And I told them what it cost to get it. 4 years, line by line. A roof grant, 19 scholarships, a reserve that meant we never had to choose between the light bill and the pantry. I told them I was not standing up to stop their dreams. I was standing up so they would know the price of what they were about to pledge. Because nobody who built this with their tithes for 40 years should mortgage it without understanding it. You could have heard a hymnal drop, and then old Deacon Fry, who is 81 and does not say much, stood up in the back and said, "Naomi caught the bank stealing from us in 1994. If she says read the book, read the book." And the room turned, not into a mob, into a congregation remembering itself. The vote on Vision 2030 was tabled that afternoon. They formed a committee, a real one, with the building fund put back where it belonged and an outside audit ordered, the kind I used to pass without a single finding. The pastor's grand timeline did not survive contact with the truth. Now here is the part you may not expect. The part that is the whole reason I am telling you this, instead of just being satisfied. When it was over, when the room was buzzing and people were coming up to thank me, and a few of the young families were looking at Pastor Dean a little differently, he came over to me. He did not fall on his knees. He did not weep and beg my forgiveness. I want to be honest with you, because I think the honest version is more useful than the one where the man you wronged gets a perfect apology. He just looked at me, and something behind his eyes had changed, and he said, quiet, "I should have come to you first." That was all. I should have come to you first. It was not everything, but it was true, and a true small thing is worth more than a grand false one. And the committee asked me to take the books back, stand back up, run the finance committee, be the financial officer again, set it all right. The whole room wanted me to, and I said no. I want to tell you why, because this is the part I prayed about at that kitchen table, and it is the part I most want the woman listening to me to hear. I did not say no out of spite. I said no because I had finally understood something it took me 59 years to learn. I had spent 30 years proving I belonged in a room that should never have needed the proof, and I was done auditioning for my own worth. Taking the keys back would have meant going right back to being the foundation everybody stands on and nobody names until the building starts to shake. I did not want my last act at Greater Mount Moriah to be picking up a weight that I only got to keep as long as I kept earning it. So I did something else. I had that $250,000 worth of stewardship in my hands and a head full of 30 years of knowing how to keep a community solvent. And I thought about all the other little churches in Macon that were 90 days from the Auctioneer right now, with no Naomi in the supply closet. And I started a fund, a real one, a community stewardship fund that helps small Black churches and their pantries and their scholarship programs keep honest books and stay out from under predatory loans. I do the training myself. I teach old deacons and young first ladies and anybody who will sit still how to read the most honest book in the building. We have helped 4 congregations in the first year. None of them is going to lose its building on my watch, and none of them is going to wait 30 years for somebody to say their name. The first one was a little church out in Twiggs County, 60-some members, that a finance company had talked into a loan they could never have carried, with a balloon payment hiding in the back of it like a snake in tall grass. The pastor there was a woman about my age, and she had signed it because the man in the suit told her she did not need to bother reading all those pages. I read all those pages. I found the balloon, and I found a clause buried near the end that let them refinance with no penalty inside the first year. And I sat at her kitchen table the way I had sat at my own, and we got that church out from under it with 2 weeks to spare. She keeps her own books now. I taught her how to read the most honest book in her building, And the look on her face when the numbers finally made sense to her was worth more than every meeting they ever locked me out of. I gave the keys back, all 11 of them. I laid that ring on the table at the end of the business meeting, and I will not lie to you, it was light in my hand after I let it go, and I had carried the weight so long that the lightness felt strange, almost like loss. But then I drove home, and the next morning, I had a new key made, a single one, to the little office where I run the fund. One key to a door I built myself. And I have come to think that is the better kind of key, not the kind somebody hands you and can ask back, the kind you cut yourself for a door that is yours. So let me leave you with this. Whoever you are, however you are listening tonight, if you are the woman who holds it all together while other people hold the microphone, hear me. Your worth was never up for a vote. The room that needs you to prove it is telling you something about the room, not about you. You do not have to get bitter, and you do not have to get loud, and you surely do not have to shrink. You can just open the book, tell the truth, set the record straight, and then walk out the door you built with your own 2 hands, with your head as high as it has ever been. They thought I had done enough. They were right about that, just not the way they meant it. I had done enough for them. It was time I did something for me, and for the 4 congregations after me, and for every woman who has ever been mistaken for the help in a house she built from the foundation up. I am Naomi Calloway. I keep books, and money does not lie. People do. The trick, the whole grown folks trick of it, is learning to read the ledger and to know your own worth, so that the day they hold out their hand for your keys, you already know exactly what they are worth and exactly what you are. If a woman like the one I described just came into your mind, somebody in your family or your church or your job who carried it and never got named, go on and put her name in the comments where I can read it. Let's say it out loud for once. And if this story sat with you, you know what to do to hear the next one. Take care of yourself, and do not you ever shrink.